Welcome to the Brand Archive, a Good Kids podcast where we dive into nostalgic brands and we learn what went well, what didn't go so well, and what we can learn from it along the way. I'm your co-host, Ben.
And I'm Ashton.
Today we're opening the archive on one of the world's most ambitious brands, NASA. A government brand that reaches for new heights and reveals the unknown for the benefit of humankind.
So this is a fun one to look back because I feel like growing up, everyone knew of NASA, everyone was familiar with it. It didn't matter what age, who you were, where you lived. Like,
right.
NASA.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating things about this brand particularly is it is one of the only brands that would actually associate with.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably one or two others that you're even like familiar with at
Right.
all.
But even that, it's like wearing FBI on a t-shirt. I don't know if I would necessarily do that, but wearing the word NASA on a t-shirt, I feel like I could wear that anywhere. Well, maybe not anywhere, but I feel like I could wear that on any weekend and go to the mall and feel good about it.
Yeah, and because it's so well known, it was a fun one to look back at the history of it because, you know, it's still around today, it's still thriving, it's still reputable.
Right.
So it was fun to kind of go back and learn the history of it all. I know that it started in 1958 and it was because of the space race, but maybe there was something before that?
Well, just real quick, before that, it was NACA, and they helped build airplanes for I believe, the Air Force or something like that. They were developing airplanes. But then they developed into NASA for the space race.
Okay, yeah, because Russia was trying to get to the moon and we wanted to get there first. And so they're like, we gotta put our, what's the phrase? We gotta put our feather in the hat.
Right. And if you could imagine, we weren't exactly leading that race when NASA was formed.
And that's crazy to me because obviously we know how it ends.
Right.
But to think that like we were behind at some point. I mean, I'm sure it was a tough battle, but
right.
Yeah.
Well, because Russia, I think what really kicked our butts into gear was Russia sent in their Sputnik.
Okay, so then they're like, we got to get serious about this.
Yeah, they sent a little Sputnik into the atmosphere.
I love that name, Sputnik. What I also found interesting was, of course, there's the moon landing, but that didn't happen until 1969. So that's a whole 11 years
right
after they were formed, after the battle began. And so what seems, you know, like in movies, it seems like it was a year or two, maybe. It was actually like 11 years in the making.
Right. And you might think that the first goal was to go to the moon, but I think the first goal was to just get into space, get into outer space, out of our atmosphere. So
yeah. And the other thing that I found really kind of wild was that the 3 astronauts that were on the moon landing trip, they couldn't get life insurance before going on that trip.
That's so I mean, I understand why that would be, like privatized insurance or whatever.
They're like, how do we handle this?
I get it. But the government must have covered them.
That should have been a part of their contract if it wasn't, because that's insane.
Because I couldn't imagine, could you imagine if your husband decided to go on this mission to the moon and you guys couldn't sign life insurance?
Yeah, or be protected in some way.
Right.
That's just wild. Yeah. Yeah, so hopefully they were getting compensated fairly.
Yes. Absolutely.
But that wasn't the only thing that made it to the moon.
Right. Yeah. So something really interesting about NASA is its ability to uplift other brands. And one of them is actually a font. So in 1927, way before NASA was even born, a graphic designer by the name of Paul Renner developed a grotesque font that actually he was trying to get it to, he called it like a true German font, but the Nazi party actually preferred, it was called Fractal fonts, and this is kind of like a font that has a little bit of, well, a lot of character to it, but it's like a font that you'd see in like old monks would write like this, right? So the Nazi party thought that true German fonts were really decorative. But Paul Renner actually graduated from the Bauhaus. I hope I'm saying that right. And so it had it very much that style to the font. The font was called Futura, and he named it not after necessarily, that's not actually a word, but he invented the word to just kind of represent the idea of the future.
So when he named it, he didn't know that it was going to be associated with the moon or NASA or anything.
No, not at all. He mainly was building a font that would cut all the BS, right?
All the decorative out of it.
Just make a very clean, easy to read font that will allow people to kind of upload information faster. And so this actually got adopted by the US government, and namely put into all the different switches in the spaceships so that astronauts could very quickly discern the information that they needed to grab when they're looking for the right switch. So this font actually helped astronauts do their job. And then they put it on a plaque, and it is now the first font on the moon. Probably one of the only fonts on the, maybe the only font.
And we're talking about like Futura that we know and love today.
Yeah, this is the font that all the graphic designers use in all caps to make their stuff look cool.
Wow, that's crazy because like I took a whole typography class and I'm almost positive that I never learned that.
Well, I mean, I think it's a pretty deep cut. If I think it's probably not something that we necessarily learn in school, maybe. But
sure.
But when you're researching NASA for a podcast, it just comes up.
Yeah. That's wild. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I had to double check because I just assumed that NASA was like still sending people to space. That was still our thing. Maybe we're trying to go to Mars. I don't know. So when I looked it up, I realized that we are going to space, but they're not like actively doing missions or sending people. They're just going to the International Space Station.
Right.
And then from there, they can like do research, they can do studies, that they're primarily doing robotics and things like that because it's safer, it's more cost effective, it's faster, right? They don't have to rely on these like multi-year expeditions, if you will. And so I thought that was really kind of wild.
Yeah. And like we'll find out later in the podcast, they're actually putting in efforts to help us in our daily life. So it's not necessarily always putting people into space. Now it's helping mankind. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, should we jump into the logo? I feel like we can't not talk about the logo if we're talking about NASA.
Absolutely. We have to talk about the logo.
So there's two logos, and I think we'll have to do a poll about this. Okay. Yeah. So there's the classic logo that was first created in 1958.
So real quick, I just want to touch on this. Mm-hmm. They hired just a regular illustrator to make a logo for them in 1958. Mm-hmm. And this, it is the beginning of what is now the current logo, but it was the beginning of what we're going to get into, which is the meatball.
Mm-hmm. The famous meatball.
And then a year later, 1959, they actually had a designer or somebody. I'll let you get into it. Sure. But they actually had a designer kind of like make it into a logo.
Yeah. Well, I read that it was a guy named James, and he went to art and design school, but he wasn't a designer at NASA. He was just an employee at NASA, and they did this like mass all right, we need a new logo. Let's get some submissions, and then his just won because it was the best, which thank goodness his won because he actually had design background and it, technically it was good. But it's just wild to me that this company that I have so much respect for went through that process, because that is not what I would recommend today or in the past to find a good logo.
Right. And like any logo, half of the staff at NASA, I don't think they even liked the meatball. And so there was a movement to change it. The Federal Graphics Improvement Program actually hired...
Can we get hats and go around and say that we're with that group? And
I love that idea.
Critiquing.
Yes.
Don't worry, we're with the Federal Graphics Division.
We'll get to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
Actually hired a firm to redesign the logo in 1975. So the next version of the logo is called, they ended up calling it the worm. So we have the meatball and the worm. And this one was designed with minimalism at the forefront. So some things that weren't working with the meatball was that there were very thin technical lines in it. There were sharp points, there were tiny dots, and also even things like having 3 colors. So embroidery for that first logo was difficult, and there were also some scalability frustrations with things that they had to do that kind of made this second logo something that actually needed to be done. So fun fact about if you are just listening to this podcast, you can look up both of these logos. But a fun fact about the worm is that the A's, it was mainly designed to be with simplicity in mind, but also to represent like a future focus, like have that feeling. And then also the A's were designed, I don't know how real this is, or if it was like the designer just noticed it as they were presenting the logo. Yeah. But the A's were designed as the nose of a rocket.
Oh, that's kind of a nice little hidden gem in there.
Absolutely.
If you know what you're looking for.
Yeah. And so the thing that I hate about the naming system of the meatball and the worm is I have a different name for the worm. And I think that this podcast will be like the you heard it here first moment.
Okay.
It's the meatball and the noodle, obviously. I don't understand why we diverged.
Yes, that is a much better pairing than the worm. I don't know. And yeah, who phrased that or who coined that in the beginning? Anyway.
I don't know. It was a missed opportunity. But a big question out there is with designers and with people who work for NASA is, are you a meatball person or a worm person?
Yeah, so if you're watching, you'll have to let us know what you think.
Yes, absolutely. And to us, there is a right answer.
Yeah.
Ashton, are you a meatball or a worm person?
I would have to say, technically, I go for the worm.
I think you're correct. That we need a ding ding.
That in the editing here.
Yeah. What do you win?
Yeah. NASA shirt. Hey.
Yeah. So some things about the worm is it was actually hired to do. The people hired to do it was a company called Dane and Blackburn. And so they actually hired a firm to do it. And it was really well executed. They have a brand book that is very thick. And it's one of the only brand books that you can really buy that they've merchandised. It comes in like this very NASA package. I remember seeing it. It has like a foil package, almost like a space blanket around it that you peel open and the book is in there. And really awesome technical stuff in that book. And another thing that I love about the worm is its ability to stand out from a distance. The logo, I saw it one time on a rocket, and it was just like, the end was at the top and it went down.
Sure.
And it was huge, it's huge, so you can see it from far away.
Yeah.
And I think, that's just a sign of a good logo, is something you can read from a distance, something that you can embroider, something that you can reproduce very easy. But do you know the year that they switched back to the meatball?
Yeah, 1992.
So in 1992, they had nostalgia for this meatball, and they reinstalled it into the main logo of NASA. And, I'm okay. I guess I'm okay with it.
So maybe it takes 40 years to go back. Like, that's maybe the defined window of like when you can have a heritage logo. It's 40 years. Right.
Well, the new logo, or the worm, is now a heritage logo if it was made in the 70s.
That's true. Yeah.
That's the power of a logo, I guess, is the ability to hold on to the feelings that a company gives it for long periods of time.
And then beyond the logo, I'm always looking at the brand holistically and what does it represent? What's their reputation? And I think NASA has just succeeded so well because they represent innovation, they represent excellence, integrity, teamwork, you name it. And I think, even little kids today, when they get a t-shirt with the NASA logo on it, they might not know all the details and all the history, but they know that they're wearing something that represents those things.
Absolutely.
And that's just pretty cool because that's the impression I had as a kid. And so I had to double check it when I was doing my research. Does everybody view NASA this way? I think they do. I don't know. Did you have that perspective of them growing up?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I always felt like NASA had our best interests in mind. There were a few times where, there are stories around NASA that try to test that a little bit. And one of them that I remember when I was a kid is learning about the space pen. And so the story was, how I learned about the story was that this pen cost NASA $1 million to develop. So the problem, I guess I should start with the problem. The problem was that American astronauts weren't able to write with a pen in space. And that's how it was presented to me. And it was presented that, the Russians, they just were smart and they used a pencil, obviously. So a couple of things. There's a whole other side of that story. So number one, the pen wasn't even a NASA project. It was a private project from a pen company. The pen company was owned by Paul Fisher. And Paul Fisher's goal was to make this perfect space pen.
Because everyone's goal is to make something that goes into space.
He must have been wildly successful.
He must have.
And in fact,
time on his hands.
His pen company was the developer of the first ink cartridge, refillable cartridge.
Okay.
So that must have made him enough money to just blow $1 million on this project. But the real reason that NASA wanted a pen in space instead of a pencil was they were having issues with the graphite and when you shave down a pencil to write, you got to get it to a point. And those little shavings would float around in the atmosphere.
Just imagining this happening.
Yeah.
What a problem.
and I think, from what I understood, it was getting into the mechanics of the switches. And then also, obviously, if I'm floating around in space, I don't want a bunch of graphite or even worse, lead. I don't know what they were using back then, but I don't want graphite in my lungs. I don't know.
No.
So it actually solved a practical problem that not a lot of people actually tell that side of it.
Sure.
And then what was the most crazy is I found on the internet, I don't know how accurate this is, but both Russia and America both bought this pen for about $6 a piece. It's expensive pen for back in the day, but...
Well, and if it took $1 million to make it in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know how he recouped, I don't know.
Oh, that's funny. So that's a very lighthearted situation where people maybe question NASA. And digging up the history, obviously there was the Challenger crash.
Yep.
In 1986, and then the Columbia incident later on in 2007. And, that wasn't just millions of dollars. Those were people's lives, right? So it's how did the reputation dip in those moments? And from what I can tell from history, it did. People really question, because what a public display of failure. That's insane, right? Just, my gosh, what heartbreak and traumatic situation, that all of these Americans saw on live television. And so that had to have really hurt the reputation of NASA. But today, I think those attributes are still alive and well. So how did they survive that? And I feel like it must have been the legacy that NASA carried from the moon. It's just time, right?
Yeah.
Time to heal, time to move on, time to build trust again.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Because you said you found that it actually did take a big dip when those tragedies happened. It may have been part of the decision why they moved back to the meatball.
Maybe, because let's see, 86 and then 92. Yeah, because a lot of times rebranding is a tool when there's this larger pivot happening in the company. And so if they need to rebuild trust, of course they're going to go back to the legacy meatball, right? Because that's what people know and love and what they used when they were great and when they did have people's heart and mind. So I could definitely see that being the case. But I think the other thing that's so cool about NASA is just like the legacy they have. You know, they're in movies from way back when to, you know, now there's a new series on Apple. I just watched Fly Me to the Moon. You know, like it doesn't seem to matter if it's a pen or a font or these movies. Like people love being connected to NASA.
Right.
And I think that's kudos and just speaks to the strength that brand carries even today.
Yeah, I mean, any brand that can work with another brand and lift that other brand into, you know, stardom is
literally.
I mean, there's something really powerful about that. And as a smaller brand, I think it's important to find those brands that you can align yourself with. There's a great story about a watch company, and I mean it's one of the most famous watch companies on the planet. But NASA, of course, needed watches for their astronauts, and they didn't tell people this, but they put out an RFP for a very specific watch, you know. And a lot of the watch companies kind of looked at it like, that's not worth it. Like they passed on the RFP. Omega watch company actually they rose to the call, and they built the Omega Speedmaster, which was designed in 1957, and they kind of designed it as more for like a racing watch, so for race cars.
Sure. Can you buy this watch today?
Yes, actually, okay. Yeah, it's an expensive watch. It's not as expensive as like a Rolex, but it's Omega expensive. So I think they're around like $8,000-9,000 for an Omega Speedmaster. And but you know, to this day, the claim on Omega Speedmaster is the only watch that's been on the moon. And so they're still using it as a marketing agent to sell almost half of what they sell in watches.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And that hasn't happened since 1969?
Right.
And that's still the brand promise?
So they're still the space watch. Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah, the power of legacy. That's wild.
Well, folks, it sounds like it's time for a word from our advertisers.
Advertising Your Services simplifies advertising your services by using Advertising Your Services' proprietary method. To learn more about how to advertise your services with Advertise Your Services, please contact Advertising Your Services.
Well, they sound like they really know how to advertise, which is great because we don't offer that.
We don't do that. I'm glad we partnered with them for this.
Yeah, perfect sponsorship placement. Oh, man. Well, before we go to the end here, we definitely want to speak to some of the takeaways because we know that there's so much to learn from brands like NASA. And so one of the key takeaways that I think we can reflect on and we can use from NASA is how a brand is so much more than a logo. Just because we've seen how objectively the worm's better, or maybe you love the meatball, or it doesn't even matter what the logo is because we know what they represent, and that's carried across all time with the watch and the shirts and the apparel and everything else. And so I always think of a logo as like a battery that you buy and it's uncharged. It's this battery, and your brand is constantly charging it up. And so everything your brand does, whether you're shaking hands with somebody or helping them through a buying process or showing up on social media. I mean, every piece of what you do as a brand charges that logo up. And what people experience with you along the way, that's how they feel about that logo. So if they like your brand, they're probably going to like your logo. And that's not that's a very oversimplification, but that's kind of the gist of it. And I think you want to make sure that the logo is setting the right expectation for the experience that they're going to have with you. But
there's a lot of wiggle room there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think just because you have a good logo doesn't mean you have a great brand reputation, right? Like you
Right.
can have the fanciest polished logo out there that you think is cool, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your brand reputation is good, that your product is great. And so they definitely both need to be in place for it to be a successful partnership and a successful marketing tool.
Right.
And so if you, for one, if you don't have a great brand reputation and you have a great logo, work on that first.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely. I can't tell you, when I first started working as a designer, I remember a lot of clients, they'd come to me and the logo, if we fix the logo, the business will be successful. And most of the time I'm like, maybe. Let's have a
Yeah.
conversation first before we.
It's a part of the puzzle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. So anyway, whether you like the meatball or the worm or the noodle, as Ben calls it, it's really more so about the entire picture and all of that NASA has done along the way, regardless of that logo. The second thing that really stands out to me with NASA is just the impact of their legacy and how even though it's, spanned so many years and they're definitely a legacy brand, what I
Yep.
would consider, they've been able to keep it alive and modernize it because like today, I could go to Target and get a shirt with the NASA logo on it and be proud to wear that. And so they've bridged this gap of the legacy that they built way back when with the moon landing, all the way through today with these modern day partnerships, modern day apparel, so that it still feels fresh, it still feels new, but you're able to like be a part of history still.
And this is probably a terrible light to put it in. Imagine going to Target and being like, I'm gonna get myself that IRS shirt.
Not as exciting.
Although it's kind of exciting. That's actually kind of a cool shirt.
I want, what did you call it? The Federal Graphics?
Yes.
That's the shirt that I want. So we're going to make this after
Federal
that.
Graphics Improvement Program or whatever.
Yeah.
I love this idea. So maybe these shirts will be for sale at the Good Kids website someday.
Oh, that's a good idea. Stay tuned.
Yes.
The third thing that I just, we didn't really talk about SpaceX much, but like even the best brands, including NASA, like they're eventually going to have competition and that's going to have to drive adaptability, right?
Right.
Because they have been able to lean on excellence and innovation and all of these things, but they just really didn't have, besides Russia, right? They didn't have a ton of competition.
Right.
Within America. And so now there's all these groups popping up and they're sharing that headspace in within America, right? They're sharing like who do we connect space with and innovation with. And so I think it'll be really interesting moving forward to see how NASA adapts to that.
Right.
To see if, is SpaceX going to be more so who we think of when we think of those traits and NASA's going to go to the wayside, or is NASA going to adapt and continue to pivot and continue to keep them fresh in everyone's minds in America?
Well, it's such a good thought because we know somebody who was contracted by NASA, and that on your resume, I feel like you've done it. You can get any engineering job you can think of if you have NASA on your resume. I know that there's flaws in this thought that I have, but I almost trust somebody who was contracted by NASA more than somebody who's contracted with SpaceX, which, SpaceX is arguably doing more engineering as far as getting us into space.
Sure. Yeah.
But for some reason, NASA just holds so much weight in my mind.
Yeah, it's true. And it's maybe more familiar. Maybe it's been around longer, but you're right. There's that like invisible sense of credibility there that like,
Yeah.
just, it's hard to imagine that ever going away.
Yeah, it's a testament to the power of what branding can do. There's always going to be somebody who's stronger, faster, smarter, who's going to come out of nowhere. And they're going to have to prove themselves. Like they might have the edge, but your brand is going to do a lot of work in still maintaining, yes, there's this going on over here, but we're still different and we're still us, and there's still a lot of weight to that.
And publicly, I think it lets you, like behind the scenes, it lets you pivot and explore new options, and it kind of buys you that time, because if the brand is strong, it gives you that affordability of time to kind of decide how do we need to pivot and where do we go next. And the brand will carry that reputation forward, even if you do change or pivot or grow in some way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we end the episode here, we always want to take audience questions. So watch for that on social for future episodes. But the question that we got for NASA was, how has their technology shaped industries beyond space exploration? And we've kind of talked about some partnerships, but I thought it was crazy to learn all the different technologies that NASA has impacted that has like nothing to do with space.
And also that impacts our life. Like,
yes.
Almost every person in the US is impacted by the technology that they've created.
Yeah, so some of the ones that I discovered were memory foam, which, I mean, who doesn't love memory foam on like rugs, beds, you name it. Scratch resistant lenses for helmets, LASIK surgery. Like, that's crazy. And that's because they needed to track eyes in space.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. To make sure that they don't like, what was it? Like, so they don't get dizzy or something? I don't remember exactly what it was, but yeah.
But that's like, so many people have LASIK. And that's because of solar cells, enriched baby formula. So as a new mom, that one definitely caught my eye. I was like, and I'm sure it goes back to them figuring out how to have food in space.
Do you think that the astronauts were eating from bottles?
I don't think so, but who knows?
The one that I found that is just burned into my brain, and it's something that like I almost wish I didn't know, is they were trying to figure out how do we get the amount of water that it takes to sustain life for 6 astronauts for this many months? I don't know.
Sure.
The amount of time you need to be up there. And it, like, in order to carry the amount of water, it would cost millions of dollars. So instead, they kind of came up with the idea of, you know, in Dune, where everybody has like a little pack and they must like pee in their pants and then it gets cycled into water again.
Delicious.
Apparently they installed that sort of system into the rocket.
What?
So they're recycling their water while they're up there. I don't know how it works. But definitely they are recycling their water up there while they're so that's how they're surviving.
Sure, yeah.
And now water treatment plants actually use the same technology to treat our water.
Wow. So filtered water is thanks to NASA.
Yum.
That's just so cool though, because the next time you're at the water cooler,
Right.
you'll know.
Well, that's all we have for NASA today. Join us next week as we open up the case file on a brilliantly rebellious smartphone company.
Is it?
It's not Apple. We're talking BlackBerry.
That's going to be a good one. If you'd like to hear more from the podcast, be sure to follow and subscribe before you go. That way you can engage with us with those audience questions, maybe request a brand that we review in the future, you name it. So we'll see you next week.
Bye.